Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. Great to have you with us. I hope you're having a good holiday weekend. I'd like to welcome Jay. Jay, you want to say hi? My co-host, Jay Copley.
Hello, Mark, and hello, everybody. Look forward to a great session.
Thanks. Good to see you, Jay. Thank you. So for those of you who are new to the Seekers Forum, and we have many new members this month, I will be giving a short talk. Then we will be doing a brief writing exercise, and then we'll open the call up to questions and answers and comments. So this month we're looking at the wheel of life and the notion of fortune and what fortune actually means. And if it's possible to be free in the midst of life's vicissitudes, regardless of what happens to us. Now, the historical idea of fortune as something that is beyond our control is as old as our species. In the ancient Roman religion, fortune, of course, is depicted as a goddess who turns the wheel of our fate with her toe. And this disempowering, externalized, circumstantial view of fortune has prevailed throughout our history. In this view, as human beings, we are really the playthings of the gods. We're either the victims or the victors of our own fate. And we can never be truly free because fate, or this fortune wheel, dominates our possibilities. There might be moments of liberation, but they're going to be very short-lived. And the best we can really hope for is to seize them when they come and then pray for them to return again. In this scenario, we're a bit like lemmings on a wheel that just keeps turning, just keeps tossing us from the top down into the pits. And no matter how diligently we struggle to be good, to wake up, to treat others well, to hold tight to our own advances, we can't. In this old-fashioned paradigm, humans are born to fight the good fight against a heartless creation. In Sonnet 29, Shakespeare captures this sentiment beautifully. He says, "When in disgrace, with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least." So that's the old idea of the human being as this quixotic, doomed hero, shaking our fists at God, troubling deaf heaven with our bootless cries. In this classic way of looking at our existence, the quality of our lives are determined by our circumstances. And power lies forever outside of us in a game that is really stacked against us, that's really rigged. And the best we can do is hope and pray and wait for fortune to smile down upon us. Now, the idea that we are hapless victims of our own fate reflects what Marty Seligman, who's one of the founders of positive psychology, refers to as learned helplessness. Learned helplessness. This is a very important point. Learned helplessness is defined as, quote, behavior that is exhibited by a subject after enduring repeated aversive stimuli beyond their control. In other words, we are presented with situations that we can't surmount and eventually just give up. Before the advent of positive psychology, it was believed that learned helplessness arose from a subject's acceptance of their powerlessness, even when alternatives might be available. Okay? That's why it's called learned helplessness. It calls to mind the image of a bird sitting behind bars of a cage with the door open, but not flying away. But over the past few decades, this whole theory of what learned helplessness means has actually been overturned by neuroscience. Neuroscience has actually shown us that the original theory had it backwards. Okay? Instead of helplessness being something that we learn, it is in fact the brain's default state, right? We have evolved to be helpless, to see ourselves as powerless. The animal is born to believe that, quote, control is not present, meaning that helplessness, meaning that rather helpfulness, sense of personal power and the ability to stand up to our fate is what's learned. Okay, it's not the helplessness that's learned, it's the helpfulness that's learned. In other words, our reptilian brains evolved with the animal's assumption that we are inherently powerless in this overwhelming dimension. This belief in our own helplessness, the fact that it's our natural state as creatures, is connected to a whole suite of ideas that have done a great deal of harm in human life. Okay, it's the same prehistoric impulse that tells us that men should dominate women, that we should rape the earth for whatever we can, that we should live selfishly, that tribal conflicts should continue as we struggle for dominance of our antagonistic planet. The need for dominance arises from the fact that we see ourselves as essentially helpless. Okay? If we didn't see ourselves as the playthings of circumstance or as victims, we wouldn't be such bullies. We wouldn't be so rapacious. We wouldn't be so aggressive. If we didn't see ourselves as naturally weak and ineffectual and victimized, we would recognize the power that we actually have. The belief in personal weakness, as all of you know, leads to enormous abuses in many areas of our lives. And nowhere worse than in how we abuse ourselves for feeling so small and so ineffectual. It's this victim mentality that perpetuates war, that encourages selfishness, and also that relies on rigid morality, fundamentalism, and tribal conflict to create an illusion of order and safety in a universe that we fundamentally believe is out to get us and where we have no control and no power. But there is, in fact, a whole different way of looking at fortune and personal power and helpfulness. Okay? As Marty Seligman points out, helpfulness, this cultivation of self-awareness, of choice, of power, requires effort. Okay? It requires personal evolution. Self-knowledge and freedom aren't things that we are given by nature. They require practice, like meditation, like yoga, like art, like music, like many of the things that matter most in our existence. These kinds of activities strengthen capacities that are latent in us, but have yet to be developed. They enable us to transcend outdated behavior and step into an awakened life through practice. For example, our human ability to observe the mind, metacognition, is inborn, it's latent. We come into our lives with it. But the power to use these observations to free ourselves is learned and must be repeated and practiced to become functional in our lives. Okay? It's often said that to acquire any kind of proficiency in an art requires about 10,000 hours of practice. And the same is true for claiming freedom from our own thoughts and misbeliefs and the behaviors that victimize us and cause us to suffer. Okay? Nature isn't going to remove these obstructions for us. We need to dissolve them through learned repetition and realizing that we've missed the essential point about what helpfulness and empowerment actually means and where it comes from. Until we come to see that practice and choice supersede our external situation, and that what we do with what we're given is far more impactful than what we are given, than the circumstances themselves, until we get that, we lose out on the opportunity to be free in our lives. Free exactly as we are, where we are, as who we are, with nothing to change but our perspective. With the exception of extreme physical suffering, and I'm not being glib, there are certain situations where we can't step back and observe and look at our perspective and shift our story. But with the exception of that very small percentage of experiences like physical pain, there are very few situations that actually overpower this ability to step back and to watch our thoughts and to change the lens that we see through. Okay? The ancient Stoics called this practice turning the obstacle upside down. And that ability to turn the obstacle upside down, to reimagine new possibilities, is completely unique to us as human beings. Unfortunately, a lot of people go through their lives unaware of this latent strength, which is actually only becoming more important as the world becomes less certain and more challenging and dangerous. Okay? The more limiting worldly affairs become, the more threatening outside becomes, the more important it is for us to be strong within and unlimited in our ability to imagine and to choose differently. Okay? Without that imagination, the ability to look to see new realities, we can't maintain our spiritual health. Okay? We're too identified with our circumstances. We're too stuck to that wheel. And the key word here is imagination. Okay? Imagination is the superpower at the heart of human existence. Imagination is the superpower at the heart of human existence. Imagination comes from the root for to picture to oneself, and it allows us to create images from within ourselves that we can then live toward, that we can create from. Okay. Imagination is the capacity that gives us many of the things that we consider essential to human life, from language to romance, to urban planning, to spiritual practice, which also involves imagination. There are many spiritual practices, in fact, that use visualization as a way of clarifying, focusing, balancing the mind. Considering spiritual ideas, images, situations is an elevating practice, and the imagination is key for that. Through the imagination, we shift how we live, beginning with how we imagine our own existence, as well as the cosmos itself and our place within the cosmos. In a writing class recently, I asked folks to choose an image for looking at their own lives. Do you see your life as a battle, as an adventure, as an experiment, as a cosmic joke, as a fool's game, as a classroom? Do you see your life as a trial? I asked folks to really look at which of these images on a list that I gave them they most identified with in terms of how they saw themselves in their lives. And what we realized is that the metaphors that we use, the analogies, the similes that we use to tweak the imagination, affect how we live and what we believe is possible more profoundly than we can imagine. Now, without imagination, conscious choice would actually be impossible. Without this ability to consider alternatives, we wouldn't be able to decide between this or that in any rational kind of way. We'd just be reacting to stimuli and taking the path of least resistance, which when it comes to the serious issues of our lives is often disastrous. When it comes to love, when it comes to work, when it comes to healing, when it comes certainly to morality, taking the path of least resistance is a surefire way of not living up to our own potential. Okay. When we just go for immediate gratification, the path of least resistance, we fail to aspire and to rise to what is actually possible for us. Because remember, nature doesn't care about our happiness. Okay? We haven't evolved as creatures to be happy. We've evolved to survive. And happiness, choosing to be happy, to make choices that benefit ourselves as well as other people, in spite of a lack of immediate gratification, requires ongoing practice. And it's what defines us as human beings and enables us to transform and to evolve. The ability to observe ourselves and to make new choices, regardless of whether or not they are immediately gratifying to us. And of course, that's why we're here in this group, because as seekers, we recognize that the quality of our lives is within our power to change, even when our circumstances aren't. Okay? When I was a young man confronted with a fatal disease, I was desperate to find ways of coping with the terror in my mind, with the uncertainty, with the stress in my body, and with these terrible stories that would spin in around up here around death and destruction. But even in my darkest times, and this period lasted for about 10 years, I was always aware of a part of me watching myself suffer. I was aware that I was living a kind of narrative, that the idea of being sick, being young, being snuffed out before my prime had become central to my own imagination, as well as my own self-image. It had come to form the lens that I viewed the world through. And that lens was based on a sense of affliction, which Simone Weil, the French philosopher, compared to a condemned man who's forced to sit next to the guillotine for hours. That's going to cut off his head. Okay, that image of just being in the presence of your own impending death completely defined my sense of self and my sense of what was possible. My life had become a kind of extended death watch. And I realized that I couldn't go on living that way. Regardless of what happened to my body, I could not live that way. I couldn't survive that way as a soul. To survive as a soul means having the ability to imagine different outcomes, even if the different outcome is a shift of perspective. If I was just stuck to this wheel like this lemming, unable to change my own mind, I would just as soon have ended my life and gotten it over with. But the truth is that I wasn't a lemming. We are not lemmings, no matter what happens to us. And no matter how grim I got in those difficult years, I never wanted to end my life. I just wanted a new way of seeing. I wanted a new way of being, which is what brought me to the seeker's path. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that the way I saw the world, my entire sense of reality, was actually warped. And that what I took to be true, this material world that could be measured, the circumstances, the situation around me, was in fact only a very, very small part of the picture of what reality consists of. In fact, it's the tiniest part of the picture I would come to discover. And I came to see that the mind, this mind that was causing me so much trouble, was in fact the thing that was spinning the wheel that was causing the suffering. Okay? This mind of mine was far more heartless and fickle than any haughty Roman goddess. I was an expert at punishing myself. But the more I learned, the more I practiced, the more I grieved, the more I healed. And the clearer I became over how deluded I actually was, like 99% of the people on this planet. Deluded by the idea that this sad little me, this tale of woe, was stuck to me, and I had no capacity to change what was happening. Eventually, though, I luckily came to experience what wisdom teachers have told us forever, which is that happiness is an inside job. Okay? I could change my life by changing my thoughts. I wasn't a victim of circumstance. I was, in fact, a human being having immortal experience that I could choose to imagine differently. And this changed everything for me. Because instead of seeing myself as a condemned guy, staring at the guillotine that was going to chop off my head, I could see myself as somebody on a path of self-discovery, as somebody on a path of healing, as somebody who was waking up, as someone who was undergoing transformation. I could view my life dynamically instead of feeling stuck and victimized. And I could also factor in mystery, all the things that had yet to be revealed to me. I could factor in all of those things into this picture of my existence. I didn't have to sit with this reduced, very, very sad picture of who I was and what was happening to me. It doesn't mean that I didn't get scared, that I didn't have terrible days. I absolutely did. But I was aware that they were passing, and that there was a chink in my awareness of a different way of living, a way of living with questions, a way of living with life as a process of evolution, rather than a doomed affair that was, pretty scary and pretty hopeless. Now, every day of our lives, we have the ability to choose how we live. We have the ability to learn helpfulness instead of helplessness, even when we find ourselves in the face of terrible odds. Jay, could you pull up the first slide, please? These are just some questions that are really worth thinking about in your own practice. Do you believe fundamentally that you are powerless before the whims of fortune, that you are a victim of your circumstances? Let these questions sit with you. Do you resent the circumstances of your life, including the limitations that are posed by the pandemic? Or do you realize that freedom is within your grasp through a practice of self-inquiry? Do you really believe that, or does it feel like a story? Do you recognize that imagination is key to resilience and changing perspective? So important. Jay, let's pull up the next card. There we are. Next, do you believe that happiness comes from outside of you, and that it comes more from what happens to you than how you respond to what happens to you? That's an essential distinction. And finally, are you able to make conscious choices regardless of external events, including how you choose to respond to life? Can you avail yourself of what Viktor Frankl called the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose how we respond to our circumstances? Or do you view that as a kind of feel-good story invented to buck up our spirits, which has no objective validity? These are great questions to ask yourself for self-inquiry. Now, in closing, I just would like to talk about 5 important propositions to consider around fortune and her wheel, and disabusing ourselves of this old prehistoric idea of our own powerlessness in this adversarial universe. The first is that what you think is not the truth. And it sounds obvious, but that's a radical idea for a lot of people. What's going on in your mind is not the truth of what is happening. What's going on in your mind is the creation of interpretations and narratives. What's going on in your mind is a kind of framing of reality that necessarily leaves out a lot of things and focuses on others. It doesn't take in the whole of what is going on. And when you realize that this is so, and you begin to question your thoughts, through self-inquiry, you realize how fixed and how held you've been by beliefs and prejudices, biases that you identified with being you, which were in fact inherited ideas or simply notions going through your mind. It's very important to understand that our thoughts are not reality. And as obvious as that sounds, I promise you, we forget it, most of us, 100 times a day. Okay? And in fact, we're so insecure that we often would rather hold on to our stories, even when we know that they're not true or when they cause us suffering, than risk letting them go, or risk even looking closely at the interior of our minds and seeing what's there. The second proposition is that how you see is how you live. How you see is how you live. Another way of saying that is what you believe to be true is what is true for you. The images that you use to think about your life have power. So ask yourself, what are the images that you use to imagine your own existence? Because these mental contents, as I was just saying, create a screen. They create a lens of what you believe is possible for you, who you are, who you're not. And if you view yourself as a lemming on the wheel of fortune, stuck there, just waiting to be tossed into the pits, that's how you're going to live. Okay? If you're attached to this little woe is me story, this little ego saga, that's going to shape your beliefs and your choices, your aspirations, and also increase the sense of helplessness in your life. Ralph Waldo Emerson called this the angle of vision. We must question our angle of vision to understand our perspective on the world. Otherwise, we take it for reality and forget that we are just we're conning ourselves on a regular basis. The third proposition is that awakening requires imagination. And of course, I've just been talking about that imagination is what gives us the ability to see beyond appearances, right? In the same way that the mind creates hard and fast beliefs, depending on what we believe we see, it also has the ability to transcend appearances, to investigate alternatives, and to imagine itself differently. The next proposition is that authentic happiness doesn't depend on external conditions, and I think we have covered that. This runs directly counter to everything, nearly everything that we are taught in a materialistic and meritocratic culture. Okay? But seekers are aware that that no matter how wonderful things are or how miserable things are, that they are always changing. That these external events simply cannot be depended upon to provide us with any secure sense of well-being. Somewhere in the Bible, it compares that to putting our eggs in a basket with a big hole in it. Okay? When we put our happiness in the basket of circumstance, it's bound to splat. It's bound to be destroyed. Okay? That is what leads to feeling that life is a fool's game and that we're the victims of circumstance. Happiness doesn't come from doing or having or achieving or competing. Happiness comes from being as we are without resistance or judgment. That's as good a definition of happiness as I know. Happiness comes from simply being as we are without resistance or judgment. That it interrupts this perseverating, arguing, problem-creating function of the mind that makes our lives so hellish. And finally, conscious choice is the path to freedom. Understanding that choosing is within our power. Choosing to explore ourselves, to seek new solutions, to assume new perspectives, not to surrender to helplessness, but instead to surrender to the power of choice and the power of possibility as the only real path of freedom. This is so important. I say path to freedom, but that's really just a matter of speaking, because freedom isn't something that's out there or something apart from ourselves. It's not some liberated state that we are traveling to. Freedom exists within us. It's our true nature. It is what we actually are, alive, aware, and vibrant. And this freedom can actually be accessed anywhere, at any time, by anyone who chooses the way of spiritual freedom. So now I'd like to do a brief writing exercise together. Please, Jay, could you pull up the next card? There we are. Okay, folks, we're going to take 10 minutes now to explore the question, do you believe that conscious choosing is the path to freedom? Why or why not? And be as specific as you can be. Do you actually believe that choice leads to freedom? And if you don't believe that, why don't you believe that? You don't have to write beautiful prose. You can make a list. You can just take notes. But put down on paper your heartfelt response to this quote, and we'll take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together as a group.